The federal budget deficit in 2015-16 was $39 billion, which was 2.4% of GDP. In the 2016-17 federal budget announcement, the then Treasurer, Scott Morrison MP, I wonder how his career has turned out, has said that the government planned to reduce the deficit by $2.3 billion to $37 billion, which would be 2.2% of GDP. Is this expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy? Normally, in any budget, the tax revenue and government expenditure will increase each year. So this is not very interesting or useful. What is more interesting and useful is to look at the increase in tax relative to the increase in government expenditure. If the increase in the amount of money withdrawn from the economy is greater than the increase in the amount of money injected into the economy, then we can say that this is a contractionary fiscal policy stance. What's also interesting is to compare tax revenue as a percentage of GDP with government expenditure as a percentage of GDP over time. And what we can look at is the government's projections that are fairly recent. Obviously, they're not that recent because the COVID-19 crisis has completely blown the budget and the budget projections out of the water. Anyway, before all of that happened, the government had these projections in mind. As you can see there, the expenses or expenditure as a percentage of GDP was planned to fall, and revenue, especially tax revenue, as a percentage of GDP was projected to rise. And by this method, the government was intending to run budget surpluses and use the surplus to pay off the relatively small public debt. So the government in 2015-16 was not just running a contractionary fiscal policy stance then. It planned to continue that contractionary fiscal policy stance over the coming years. Given that the official unemployment rate in 2016 was approximately 5.7%, and there is probably some hidden unemployment and underemployment, which would make the unofficial unemployment rate approximately 10 or 11%, what would be a Keynesian macroeconomist's evaluation of the government's 2015-2016 budgetary decision? That decision is a contractionary budgetary decision. For most Keynesians, unemployment is really front and centre as an economic problem. It's the most important economic problem which must be solved first. It's more important than inflation, it's more important than a current account deficit, it's more important than public debt. Furthermore, Keynesians believe that there's no inherent tendency in capitalism to immediately correct mass unemployment, to eliminate mass unemployment by market forces alone. So, because Keynesians are so morally concerned with unemployment, and they believe that the economy on its own won't fix that problem, they will tend to argue that governments should increase government expenditure immediately to stimulate production and employment and to encourage optimistic sentiments about profits in the future by investors, thereby stimulating economic growth and reducing unemployment. So, in the context of the 2015-2016 budget, which was contractionary, a Keynesian economist would vehemently disagree. They would argue there is still a substantial amount of unemployment, and that should be dealt with by the government. The government should increase government expenditure relative to taxation, and therefore create not a smaller budget deficit, but a larger budget deficit. It should strive for a larger budget deficit. Let's say Keynesians were in control of the government and they wanted to increase GDP by $30 billion. Obviously, this is a funny number because that's a drop in the ocean, but nonetheless. Let's further say that the fiscal multiplier is 1.5, meaning that if the government increases government spending by $1, it will be multiplied through the economy by 1.5 times that. By how much would the government have to increase the budget deficit? Or increase government expenditure, really, assuming all other things remain constant. So the idea here is that by increasing government expenditure, ceteris paribus, this money will be multiplied through the economy by a factor of K, the fiscal multiplier, resulting in an increase in GDP. A simple little equation captures the idea. Increase in government expenditure multiplied by K equals the increase in GDP. Now, our target is to increase GDP by $30 billion, and we have an estimate of K, the fiscal multiplier, of 1.5. So all we have to do is plug those numbers into our equation, and then we have to just solve it for the increase in G. So it will be $30 billion divided by 1.5 gives us $20 billion. That's how much government expenditure would have to be increased by in order to generate the $30 billion in GDP. Easy.